In Parashas Devorim, when Moshe blesses the Jewish people with exponential growth, they feel shortchanged because ultimately human brochos are nothing like divine brochos. Al pasuk, when commenting on the pasuk that says Hashem Elokei Avosechem, Moshe says to the Jewish people that Hashem, God of your fathers, Yosef Aleichem Kochem Elef Pe'omim, may He increase who and what you are now 1,000 times over. V'yivorech eschem kasher diber lochem, and He should bless you as He has said He would. Pirish Rashi explains as follows. He says, what's Moshe telling him? He's telling them, Yosef Hashem Aleichem, that Hashem should increase Kochem Elef Pe'omim, that He should increase you 1,000-fold means. So Rashi has a question. You've just said you're blessing them that they'll increase 1,000-fold. So what does Moshe now repeat? And He should bless you as He has said He would bless you. He already said 1,000-fold. What do you mean? And as He already said He'd bless you. Says Rashi, the Jews said to Moshe, Moshe, you're limiting our bracha. Hashem already promised our forefather Avram Avinu that how would we increase? That would be so many, it'd be impossible to count. So why are you saying only 1,000 times? So Moshe said to them, I'm giving you my bracha. He then repeats, and Hashem will bless you as He had said to you. Okay, where does Rashi get this insight from? This is a concept that is brought both in the Sifri and the Medrash on this week's parasha, which is let's see how the Sifri says it. The Jews said to Moshe, Rabbeinu Moshe, we don't want you to give us this bracha. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu yifteches Avram Avinu. Because they already promised Avram Avinu. Omar, He said, I will increase your seed like the stars of the heavens. And not only that, I'm going to make them as numerous as the grains of sand on the earth. You want to now limit it down to just 1,000 times our number? Moshe Melech Chulei. And the Sifri there gives a mashal, which we'll look at again later, basically with a youngster who the king felt was the prince was not wasn't mature enough to look after his own things, so he appointed somebody to provide for him. And at some point he says, yeah, but you're not giving me everything I deserve. And the person in charge says, don't worry, your father will give you what you really deserve. So this is what Moshe says to the Eden. Hashem David is going to bench you with 1,000-fold growth. That's my bracha that I can give to you. Yesh lochem. That's what I can give you. Then, in addition to that, then in addition to that, the Eibishter will bless you as He promised you, which is like the sand of the sea, and like the things that grow out of the ground, and like the fish of the oceans, and like the stars in the heavens. Okay, that's the Sifri. Of a Medrash is a slightly different wording in the Medrash Rabbi that says, this is what the Yidden said, Rabbeinu Moshe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo nosan kitzur levirchoseinu. The Eibishter put no limits on our brochos. And you give us only 1,000-fold. So Malohem, he says, I gave you the bracha that I'm capable of giving you. In the future, when the Eibishter comes to bless you, then He'll fulfill the promise that He made to Avram Avinu. Okay, so it would seem very much that what Rashi is saying simply, as the Midrashim are also saying, it would seem that the big issue over here is that the Yidden had a complaint that the Eibishter's brachos have no limits. So the pshat is that the Eibishter promised that the Jews will become so numerous, there's no end, there's no amount, there's no way you could count us. Which is why the Jews complain, why does Moshe give them a bracha only 1,000 times increase, which sounds limiting. Okay, so the pshat is that it sounds like everybody, Rashi and the Sifri and the Medrash, are all expressing this question the Jews had: why are you strangling our brachas? The only thing is, if you pay attention to Rashi's language, it doesn't actually sound like that's what he's saying. Out of his zayin, move on 4 questions. Aleph, Lama Shina Rashi. Why does Rashi take an approach to interpreting this pasuk which is completely different to both the Sifri and the Medrash? A pasuk b'shayla al kefal habrocha b'pasuk. Rashi's big driving question was, why is the brocha repeated twice in the same pasuk? Not, why does Moshe only say 1,000 times? Look what Rashi's language was. Mahu shuv vivarech eschem kasher diber lechem. Why, after saying that you'll be blessed 1,000 times, does he then repeat, and he'll bless you as he said? How come Rashi does not tell us the complaint the Jews would have had, kebe sifri of a medrash, which is the way the Sifri and the Medrash started this conversation? Especially when you consider that Rashi doesn't usually spell out for us what the question on the pasuk is. He just goes straight into the interpretation. And as we've seen many times. So Rashi doesn't sound like he's saying exactly the same thing as the Medrash and the Sifri, because he's coming from a different angle. Second of all, Beis, even if we didn't consider Rashi's question, why is the bracha repeated in the pasuk? Rashi would have to get to this point of saying Moshe is giving his own bracha, which is different to the Eibishter's bracha, because otherwise we'd have the very obvious question that it sounds like Moshe is contradicting what Hashem says. Hashem says you're going to be like the stars and uncountable, and Moshe is saying only 1,000 times. So Rashi would have to address this anyway, right? Gimel, thirdly, how come it is that when Rashi explains what bothered the Jewish people, what does he say? Their problem is rooted in if that, just as it's impossible to count the stars and the sand, so you can never count the Jewish people. Now that's totally different to loike b'sifri from the way the Sifri says it. The Sifri focused on the beginning of that same promise from Hashem, which is v'samte zaracha kafara oretz. I'll make your progeny as numerous as the sand. Noisef alvi basis zaracha kechech v'ashamayim, over and above the fact that it would be as numerous as the stars. So Rashi is focusing on you cannot count the Jews. That's what bothers the Yidden. And the Sifri and Medrash are focusing on the fact that David just said we're going to be like sand and stars. Why are you only saying 1,000 times? So why the difference between Rashi and the Midrashim? And lastly, Daled me'achash Rashi miyashav b'firushai. Seeing as Rashi only addresses in his commentary Rakas inyan akitzva de'elef pi'amim, he's only addressing why it says 1,000 times as opposed to all these other alternatives, not being able to count the Yidden. So why does he also quote words from the pasuk that he doesn't explain, that the Eibishter should increase? He should have only put in the headline elef pe'omim, because that's what Rashi does. He gives us the words that he plans to explain. Now there's a broader question we have to understand, and it's a fundamental question to this whole concept, and it's not a question on Rashi or the Medrash, it's a question on the whole story. What's Moshe adding by giving this bracha to the Jews? Blessing us that we'll increase 1,000-fold. Nechleles is already included, and not only that, it's actually insignificant in the context of Hashem's bracha, which is Asher diber lachem, that he had promised us, which has no limits. And this is logically strong as a question, considering that we know the Gemara always tells us, if you have 200, naturally 100 is included. So if you have an increase, a promise from Hashem that you'll increase beyond measure, obviously 1,000 times is also included. Okay, so the Mefarshim ask that question. They offer two answers that we'll consider, and the Rebbe will be dissatisfied with both answers. Many perspectives that the Mefarshim argue. Number one, Aleph, Birchas HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Tanaihi. One possibility is the Eibishter gives a massive bracha far greater than Moshe's, but it's conditional. Ve'ein ba, and it doesn't happen unless we do Torah mitzvahs. Whereas Moshe does not put any prerequisites. It's a blanket bracha, 1,000 times increase. Or another alternative from the Mefarshim, Beis, Birchas Moshe cholu bizman hazeh. Moshe's bracha is current, Whereas the massive exponential growth of the Jewish people that Hashem promises, that's only going to happen in the time of Mashiach. Now these are great explanations. They only work to answer the Sifri and the Medrash, not Rashi. Why? Because Sifri Muva, we already know the Sifri quoted. Now we'll read it in full. There was a king, it's the parable of a king who has many, many assets. And he has a son who's young and immature. And now the king has to travel. So he says, if I'm going to leave my assets in the hands of my child, he's going to splurge and spend everything and bankrupt himself. Instead, I'm going to appoint somebody to be his custodian until he's older. And then later on, the boy grows up and he says to the custodian, hey, where's my money? So the custodian tells him, anything that I've allocated to you over all this period of time is only from the budget I was given to work with. But what your father really wants you to have, it is hidden away, it's secure so that you can get it at the right time. And so that tells you the Sifri is talking about that the brocha that Hashem gives is not at the same time or in the same state that the child is in, which is of course metaphoric of the Jewish people, at the time of the brocha of the custodian, which in this case is Moshe. In other words, the Medrash is clear. The two stages of brochos. Moshe's brocha at a particular point in history, Hashem's brocha at a later point in history when Mashiach comes. And this is perhaps even more obvious in the language the Medrash uses, but then the Medrash talks about when the king will, future tense, come. Which of course references the time that the Eibishter will come to give us the full brocha. Two brochas, two different times. That's great. So the Mefarshim's explanations work perfectly according to the Medrash. But Rashi doesn't take that approach at all. And Mefarish Pshuto Shel Mikra, Rashi, who explains the simplest understanding of the pasuk, Kosav Stam, didn't give timelines. He just said simply, Zoi Misheli. The brocha I'm giving you is my brocha. Avol hu, but the Eibishter's brocha, he'll give you the brocha that he already said he would keep. In other words, Rashi doesn't say anything of these two perspectives in the Medrash, that either it's contingent on your behavior or that it's two different stages in history. And he doesn't even allude to the fact that there are two different stages or two different conditions. Vim came move on, which implies Rashi, that according to Rashi's perspective, yesh hasbara pshuta bazeh. There's a simple explanation of the difference between Moshe's and Hashem's brocha. Rashi does not have to even hint why Moshe would give a brocha when Hashem already gave a brocha. And we need to know what's that obvious explanation. It's as follows. If you're reading Pshat, which is Rashi's domain, and the truth is, you could even plug this into the Midrashic perspective. Ein kol mokum l'shayla. There's no rational reason to ask, hey Moshe, madua higbil Moshe's brochos le'elef pa'amim. Why, Moshe, did you limit your brocha to only 1,000 times growth? Whereas Hashem had promised no limits at all. Well, obviously. Because a person, no matter who they are, no matter how great they are, they're a person created by Hashem and therefore finite and limited. So they can't give a bracha that's infinite because they aren't infinite. As is explained in great detail in different books of philosophy like the Tzemach Tzedek Sefer HaChakira, that if you take finite things and you add them together or pile them on top of each other, all the finite addition in the world can never reach infinite, logically. A great example is Hemshech Hazman, the passage of time. Cannot be infinite. There is no concept of infinite time. Why not? Because time is comprised of minutes that become hours, that become days, that become weeks, that become years. If it were possible that you could take a whole lot of time and add it all up and create infinite time, then you're going to have relative infinities. Okay, going. So you'd end up with this weird relative time-bending reality. Okay, so there's infinite hours made up of finite minutes, or infinite minutes that make up so many finite hours. It's just not possible that you could have relative infinity. Either something is infinite or it's finite. If you really enjoyed the subject, have a look at what the Tzemach Tzedek says, because it's beyond the scope of this Sikha. What's relevant for us is a human, even Moshe Rabbeinu himself, has finite abilities and therefore cannot give an infinite bracha, whereas Hashem can. So it's not a big deal. How did Moshe only offer them 1,000 times? Because that's what he has available. Bichlal, so therefore we have to understand, so what's going on over here? We're talking about the large numbers, exponential growth. What do we really mean? So Bichlal, bepashtas meduva besifri of a medrash, most likely the Sifri and the Medrash are talking loy oidos bli gvul mamesh. They weren't talking about literally that there should be Jews of an infinite number. El oidos mispar godel beyoser. Rather, they're describing like the sand. It's not infinite sand or infinite stars. Just a massive amount that's beyond human comprehension. Birchas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when the Eibishter blesses, that I will bless your children like the stars, and I'll make them like the sand, without assigning a particular number to that. What the Eibishter is saying is, that there'll be so many Yidden, that will be incredibly difficult, near impossible, to count them. Like you can't start counting grains of sand. Does that mean that there's no number to sand? Of course there's a number. The Eibishter knows how many grains of sand there are. We just don't have the capacity to count them. Right? Look at the sand of the sea. And that is part of the promise to Avram, like the beach sand. As the Sifri also used that expression. There is a finite number of grains of sand. It's just that there's so many so that we can't count them. They cannot be counted because of how many they are, not because they're beyond number. You can also see this illustrated or reflected in the pasuk about Yosef at the time of preparing for the great famine of Mitzrayim. There the pasuk says, "Vayitzbar Yosef bor," that Yosef collected produce. It was so much, it was like the sand of the sea, the beach sand. The pasuk says, "Ad ki chodal lispor ki ein lispor," till they stopped counting because they could no longer count. Let's be honest, how much food did Yosef collect? Enough to sustain a nation for 7 years. That's what Yosef gathered. It was obviously a finite amount of grain. What the Torah wants us to know is, finite as it was such a massive amount. The guy, the accountant who was in charge of auditing how much grain, stopped counting because his system of accounting ran out of numbers or ran out of columns or whatever it was. So his system failed. That doesn't mean that there was an infinite amount of grain. So now let's look through before we get to Rashi, let's look from the perspective of the Medrash and the Sifri. The complaint to Moshe was, if you can put a number, even if the number is 1,000-fold, it's still a number that limits our brocha. Why? Because it's a smaller number, considerably smaller number than what the Eibishter said. Because it's a number that still works in the system. You can still count it. You can still get an Excel spreadsheet. It's not going to give you an error sign. So it's still countable. Whereas what the Eibishter gave is beyond what we can count. That's the Midrash issue. But Rashi is not looking from a Medrash perspective. He's looking at Pshat, saying, that's not such a big question. Let's be honest. Take the Jews, the population of that time, and multiply it by 1,000. It's a mega number. Therefore, Rashi doesn't start with the big question that the Yidden are complaining. It's not such a big question in Pshat, Kibbutz Sifri over Medrash. The Sifri and the Medrash have other concerns. But in Pshat, is it such a big shocker that Moshe is promising them they'd be 1,000 times greater than they are? It's okay. It's also a huge number. It kind of fits with what the Eibishter promised. What does bother Rashi in Pshat? What does bother Rashi is you just gave a brocha that they're going to be 1,000 times greater, and straight away you say, and Hashem should bless you, as he said. That's what gets us thinking. That's what stimulates the question that the Jews say, hey, 1 second, double brocha in this pasuk. That gets us thinking there's a difference between your brocha and Hashem's brocha, as we shall see. So let's first start with the most simple understanding, the pshat understanding, so to speak. Mispar b'nei Yisrael b'Yisrael hoya shishim ribay agvorim b'nei yesem at shishim shona. The Jewish population at the time was 600,000 adult Jewish males. Val mispar zeh, in addition to which, nosu agvorim ad b'nei chof, you have any other males who were not yet 20, and who were over the age of 60, plus v'noshim, there were women, v'taf, and children. Any modest guess at how many Jews there were at the time, it's 2 million at least. Okay, so multiply that by 1,000, it's 2 billion people. According to Pshat, it would not make any sense that the Jews would complain about that. That the Jews would turn around to Hashem and they'd say, oh, is it really correct that the one nation on earth should only be 2 billion people? Even today, so many years later, where the world's population has exploded to almost 8 million people, 2 billion would be massive. So according to Pshat, they're not going to complain about that. Especially void v'gam zikr. It's absolutely common in Torah that when we use the expression 1,000-fold, it's not exact. It just means a massive exponential explosion of numbers. Which could be a lot more than 1,000, and you'd still refer to it as 1,000-fold. And that would be pshat also when Moshe says you're going to increase 1,000 times. It means 1,000 thousands or 1,000 thousands. So according to pshat, the first issue in this pasuk is not the Jew saying, why are you limiting us? And especially when you think about it practically. The reality is, how many Jews could exist on the planet? It's never going to be the same amount of stars in the heavens or sand on the earth, because the continental space on earth is limited. As we're told. The Chazal tell us that the entire area of land mass on this earth is only 600 parses. And work it out mathematically. Every person needs their personal space, which is approximately 4 amos, 2 meters or so. You could do the math, and you could work out how many humans fit on this earth, on this whole earth. And especially when you consider again practically, that there are and there will always be, even in the time of Mashiach, it's not only going to be Jews, there's other humans as well. And there's animals. Bottom, people have to have homes, they have to have places of agriculture. And beyond that, where do Jews belong according to Torah? Not in Shanghai and Frisco. Where it's Israel, we belong in Israel. Yes, it is called the land that stretches like the skin of a deer, so it expands when it's full of people. But no matter how much it's going to stretch, it's always only going to just be a fraction of the continental landmass. We'll move on. So therefore it is absolutely logical that the maximum amount of human population that this earth can accommodate, it is way less than the amount of sand on the continent, and it certainly is less than the grains of sand right across the oceans, because of course the oceans occupy greater space than earth. So coming back to the simplest understanding of the pasuk, Yosef alechem kochem elef pe'omim, when Moshe promises them that they're going to expand 1,000-fold, it's not a problem or a contradiction to what the Eibishter had promised them. So that's not the first issue that Moshe is going to raise. that Rashi is going to raise. Let's be honest. When we said that you're going to be like the stars or like the sand, when the Eibishter said that, it was used colloquially, not literally. Not that there'd literally be exactly the same amount of Jews as stars or grains of sand. And the truth is, even saying 1,000-fold could also be a colloquial term to mean without number. That's not what bothers Rashi. The fact that the pasuk repeats after Moshe blessing them, and in addition to that, the Eibishter will bless you as he has said he would. That tells us something forced Moshe to say this statement. Something upset the Jews and he had to respond. And he's responding to a complaint that they had. Therefore, after identifying that the language lends itself to Moshe now responding, don't worry, Hashem will still bless you as he promised. Now Rashi says that it's because the Yidden said, you're limiting our brochos. That Avraham Avinu was already promised that we would be beyond what could be counted. So how come, Moshe, you're limiting us? Now let's look at that pasuk. That pasuk that says, is it, rhetorically, is it possible for a person to count? Kosef Rashi said on that pasuk, back then with Avraham Avinu, just as it cannot be that anybody would ever be able to count the sand, likewise your children, your descendants will never be counted. Move on. That implies that Rashi is telling us that the brocha Hashem gave is not that we will be the same amount of people as there are grains of sand. Elo, it's keshem kach, right? It's like, it's comparable. Because of the incredible number of people, lo yimnu, they won't be counted. Keshem shafar haaretz ein nimne, like sand can't be counted. That was the question / confrontation of the Jews to Moshe. Are you going to now limit our bracha? Because the Eibishter promised us we're going to have such numbers that can't or won't normally be counted, as Rashi himself said. So Ketzad said, Moshe, listen, by minion, how could Moshe use any number, even a number which could imply massive? Why use a number? Elef be'omin. A number implies something which can be counted. The whole foundation of the bracha from Hashem to Avraham Avinu is that you can't be counted. Comes along Moshe and says, and you will be counted 1,000 times. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that 1,000 times could be the most massive exponential explosion of population. But as we mentioned, that it could be a loose term or even an exaggerated term to imply multiple increases. The key indicator over here is inyan shel kitzvah. It's something related to numbers which have a limit. If it's a relative term, remember what we said, if all the minutes become hours and all the hours become days, it can never turn infinite. So if you take 600,000 Jews plus all the women and the elderly and the kids, and it's now 2 million people, that's a number. And then, kochem elef pe'omim, you multiply that number even by a massive number, it's still a number. That's the issue that Jews have. How are you taking Hashem's brocha, which is fundamentally beyond number, and giving it a number? And that's a big difference between the perspective that the Medrash and the Sifri present versus what Rashi does. If you look through the perspective of the Medrash and the Sifri, what did the Jews complain to Moshe? You're limiting our brochos. In other words, their complaint is, you're giving us far fewer people than the Eibishter gave us, because he said, the Eibishter said it would be like stars and sand. And you're saying just 1,000 times our current population size. Which explains, by the way, why the Sifri quotes early in the conversation a pasuk that actually comes later in the conversation. Ve'herbei says, that will increase your descendants like the stars of the heaven. Why does the Sifri do that? To clarify that the intention of the pasuk that when it says that you'll be like the sand, it's not like Rashi who says just like sand can't be counted. No, it actually means so many people like the sand. And so the Medrash says Moshe's cutting down the numbers majorly. According to Rashi, that's not the issue. That when the Yidden say you're limiting our brochos, and they're not saying Hashem said that massive number and you're saying that smaller number. According to Rashi, the issue is, why is a number part of this conversation at all? The Eibishter promise would be beyond number. Why are you talking numbers? That's why he quotes, he doesn't quote the psukim that speak about stars and sand, because those could theoretically have numbers to them. There's a finite amount of stars, even if I don't know how to count them. And the same with sand. And as a pasuk, rather, what does Rashi quote? The pasuk Asherim Yuchal Ish Limnois V'Goyma Kenal. He quotes the pasuk what? The question of whether it can be counted, because that's Rashi's point. The Jews are saying, why are you talking about something being counted when the Eibishter promised us a brocha that can never have a number put on it? So now Moshe's got to answer them. He answers, that's my brocha. But he will bless you as he sees fit. In other words, Moshe is not clashing with Hashem. His brocha includes Hashem's brocha. His brocha includes what the Eibishter promised. But because now I'm speaking. If it's a brocha coming from me, a human, niris, it will appear, and therefore will be stated as if it has its limits. But the Eibishter will bless you as he wishes to bless you. Meaning, I'll say what humans can say, but the Eibishter will fill in the gaps as the Eibishter can. That he is going to bless you like it's impossible to count. And it's not a clash. I'll say what humans can say, and the Eibishter will do what the Eibishter can do. You can actually see this in the language. May Hashem increase upon you as you are. Moshe is a human. Who's limited both by time and space. Moshe is a human being. Moshe as a neshama is a different story, but Moshe as a human being cannot escape the world of finite boundaries. He can't escape the fact that this is the current population size of the Jewish people. He sees what he sees, their reality, and then gives them a bracha. What bracha can he give them? Relative to who you are, I bless you with more. Because that's what a human is capable of. Whereas the Eibishter's bracha came to Eino Mugbal Klau, has no limits. Therefore, the Eibishter can use expressions like, just as nobody can count the sand, so your children will grow, so nobody can count them. That means that Moshe sees them as they are now. The Eibishter looks at them now and sees how they will be in the future, that they will be so great, so numerous, that they can't be counted. Dugma avoloi mamish ledavar, a kind of example of how this works. We'll see that as Aseres HaDibros HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael b'dibur echad. When the Eibishter said the Aseres HaDibros, one statement, all 10 dibros. And then it came out individually with every single one of the dibros. So it's a similar kind of thing. The Eibishter saying you're going to be numerous. The Eibishter can see how that's going to be. We can't see how it is, but it will play out. Now, all of this has a very deep spiritual backstory. Let's look at what the Chassidus within Rashi says. The Arizal brings in his writings, the week that the Rebbe said the Sikha that Motzei Shabbos was the 5th of Av, which is the Arizal's Yortzeit. So the Arizal quotes on this saying where Moshe says, Ad kan misheli, this that I'm giving you, that's my bracha. And what goes beyond this, that's what the Eibishter is going to give you. So the Arizal says something very intriguing. Ki Moshe, the name Moshe is Gematria Kel Shin Daled Yud. A particular combination of divine names. V'kasher oisis b'miluyon, when you take those letters and then you spell out the full spelling of each letter. Kozeh, Aleph Lamed, that's for Kel, right? But you spell it. Aleph is Aleph Lamed Pei, Lamed is Lamed Mem Daled, Shin Daled Yud, etc. So you put them all together. Yala b'gematria Elef, you get to a value of 1,000. He says that it's the number 1,000 that represents the ultimate state of bina, the ultimate state of divine understanding. Says the Arizal, Moshe was able to reach at imo until that level of bina in the realm of Atzilus, ultimate understanding of God. And therefore his bracha fits with that. The number 1,000, an increase of 1,000, which is the number associated with bina ilo'ah, with the ultimate bina as it is in the spiritual realms. Therefore he says, Ad kan misheli. That's as much as I can lift you. That's as much as I can endow in you. What bina of Atzilus has to offer. Mikan ve'elach, anything beyond this, vivorech eschemi bechinas abba ilo'ah. Any bracha beyond this, that comes from the parts of Abba, which is basically Chochmah in the highest realms, totally beyond Binu. So this gives us one of those beautiful moments where you see the harmony between the simple understanding of the Pasuk and the most esoteric understanding of the Pasuk. The numbers and the nature of the bracha dovetail with what's going on in the spiritual realms. Let's explain that better. Inyan beli kitzva, the idea of no limits. Kepirish HaSifri v'Medrash. Let's first look through the lens of the Sifri and the Medrash. They said, Amnam ein pirushoi bli mispar b'poyal. According to the Sifri and the Medrash, when it says bli kitzva, doesn't mean that there's no number. It's where you borrow a term and actually referring to massive numbers. So whenever you're using, even if you're borrowing the term without number, we're reading Torah. Torah is truth. So the concept must be truth. In other words, from the perspective of the Midrash, when the Eibishter promises Avraham Avinu, your children are going to be like sand, like the beach sand, like the stars. A number that's just beyond what we can count. The reality is, if there's something in this world that is so extensive that we can't count it, it must be because it is linked to a spiritual dimension that is beyond what can be counted, defined, limited, etc. How does that play out in our world? In the supernal realms, it's truly beyond counting, truly beyond number, truly beyond comprehension. How do we experience it in our world? We experience it as something which is so numerous, so extensive, we can't put a number on it. In other words, the so-called number or limits of this element of the Jews being like stars or sand, it's not because Jews are fundamentally finite and therefore could be like the grains of sand, that even though there's so many, they're actually finite. And the fact that the Jews live in a finite reality is a function of the fact that our neshamas entered this world, living in a finite physical world. But if you really analyze who Jews are at our core, in Yonam, our truest reality, Shosham Lamaila, our truest source, who believe Misparu Amiti is actually beyond the concept of numbers or limits or boundaries, etc. Jews are infinite. So now looking from the perspective of the Sifri and the Medrash, when we speak of these promises that the Jews will be numerous like the sand and like the stars that can't be counted, the Medrash is saying the reason that exists is because of the infinite root of the Jewish soul. Because we derive from worlds that are completely beyond definition, higher than the realm of Atzilus, because as holy as Atzilus is, it's something we can describe and in a sense, define. But if you're going to talk about numbers, and this is the complaint of the Jews, why are you using numbers? 1,000, that's part of the numbers cycle. That is, that must be talking about something which only begins in a spiritual realm of definition, i.e., 10 spheres. Those are numbers. Yes, they are in the world of Atzilus. Yes, it's very powerful, but it's a world of finite realities compared to the Oilamos Ein Sof. So according to the Medrash and according to the Sifri, that's the dynamic that's going on over here. The Eibusher links us into something which is completely infinite, and Moshe speaking a language of spiritual, godly, holy, but yet with its limits. But when you look from the perspective of Rashi, Rashi was not talking about the fact that the Jews are going to become so massive. He says it's just like you can't count the sand, so you won't count us. But practically, we're not going to be as many as the grains of the sand. Then there's a big distinction between how that brocha is voiced by Hashem and how it's voiced by Moshe. Moshe's brocha is the fact that we have limits on how many of us there will be. That's something that you could see. It's tangible. It's experienced. Look around. We're going to have our limits. So is there the possibility that limitation won't be experienced by us? Where you'll be like the sand. The sand practically has number. You just don't feel the number. There's just so much sand. You don't feel the concept of it being finite. And that's B'richas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Canal. That would be Hashem's brocha. Because we know that every single thing that exists in reality derives from an original spiritual source. If we're talking about the possibility of whether or not you can count something, we're talking about a reality that can be contained. The world of Atzilus, there's the possibility of a keli, containing the reality as we've already identified. 10 different kinds of energies. Each one looks different because each one is housed differently or expressed differently, which are the kelim. That's where the reality of division, separation, definition, and numbers come from. If you're operating from that reality, a world where there are definitions and distinctions, you eventually land up with a reality where there are numbers and limits. Whereas if we would be looking at where things originate in a world of energy, of oir, the oir that illuminates and animates those kelim, but is fundamentally beyond kelim. In other words, it's a spiritual dimension where there are none of those limits and vessels. Once you tune into the world of Or, that will evolve into our world, into something that doesn't seem to have number. Something that is so massive, so numerous, that it's like the sand or the stars, because you've tapped into a reality that's not bound by distinction and number and limits, etc. So therefore the difference effectively between Moshe and the Eibishter's brocha is do you feel the limits of the kelim? Kelim are realities that Hashem defined, that are going to distinguish chesed from gevura, soivev, well, let's not say that, one type of energy from another. Do you feel that? Do you feel those limits? Do you feel those distinctions? Or are you beyond them? Which means as far as the Medrash is concerned, the Eibishter's brocha originates from Keser, she'ein shom kelim, where there is no possibility of any kind of limitation or definition or number. Whereas Rashi's interpretation is that the Eibishter's brocha is not as high, it doesn't stem from as high as Keser, it comes from the level of Chochma, asher sham yesh kelim, where there are actually distinctions, but they don't feel separate, they don't feel independent, they don't feel conflicted. Chesed and Gevurah are not fighting. They don't see themselves as opposites. They see themselves as part of a harmonious whole. Because they are completely overwhelmed and therefore surrender to the consciousness of Hashem, the light of Hashem, the energy of Hashem. That's why it's called Chochma. That's why Chochma is called, including even the so-called finite components of Chochma, is all called Chayohi Oiris. It's all called life and energy. Whereas when Moshe speaks to the Jewish people, then he's speaking a language where you can feel numbers, limits, distinction, conflict. He's coming from the perspective of understanding, because that's what understanding is. What's Chochmah? Chochmah is this brilliant moment. Like, you don't see the details, you just see the overarching truth of a concept. That's Atzilus. Or Chochmah Atzilus. Moshe is already speaking the language of Bina. Hang on, let's understand. This goes here, that goes there. Let's try and make it all sensible, because that's what understanding is. So now you start to see the distinctions, and therefore everything has its boundaries. So you feel the kelim, you feel the distinction, you feel the limitations, and so therefore the language he speaks is about numbers. When we learn Torah using both approaches, Pshat, Rashi's approach, of Achlal Nigla de Torah, which generally represents the revealed elements of Torah, which is generally speaking the more finite elements within Torah. This is the halacha for that. It's a different halacha for this. That event happened at that particular time, which was different to this event that happened at that time. This is how you deal with this situation. That's so-and-so's opinion versus so-and-so's opinion. The numbers of Torah. And then together with that, Upnimius HaTorah, we learn the esoteric part of Torah, Teirosei Shel HaArizal, like, for example, the Arizal's teachings, Ashekedivrei HaArizal, as the Arizal famously said, Dafka B'Doros Elo HaAchronim, that it's specifically in our latter generations that mutter, we're permitted, or mitzvah, to galus Eisa Chochmah, and it's actually a requirement to reveal that part of Torah. And especially we are so privileged that in our time, these Galta B'Toros Chassidus, Chassidus has been revealed. The type of Chassidus that fills you, that satiates you, that gives you deep, meaningful understanding. So when you learn Nigla plus Chassidus, Chassidus is the part of Torah that is beyond separations, opinions, debates, machloikes, kashyas, tirutzim. When we learn both the Nigla and the Pnimius HaTorah as one single, homogeneous, harmonious Torah, then we'll see the fulfillment of that purpose, of the time when the number of the Jewish people will be beyond measure and beyond counting. In the time of Mashiach, that should happen, B'Kariv Mamish, exceptionally soon.